Today we bring to you a talk on Charles Dickens's great novel, A Tale of Two Cities. As you know, Dickens is well known for his novels of social criticism. Writing in Victorian England, he not only celebrated, but he also criticized the society of his time. In fact, in the famous opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." However, A Tale of Two Cities is different from the other novels of Dickens because it does not focus on the social ills of Victorian England. In fact, it draws its material from an earlier age, from the 18th century, from the period when the French Revolution rocked Europe. As one critic, Edgar Johnson, puts it, this is the least characteristic of Dickens's novels, something that we've also discussed in Block 2 of your course material, Block 2 of the study guide to A Tale of Two Cities. In fact, in the 6 units of Block 2, we have dealt with the different aspects of the novel. We have talked about the background of the French Revolution, how Dickens deals with it, his portrayal of women, his depiction of the personal and the political dimensions. All these aspects have been taken up in your study material. In short, what we have done is we have dealt with the theme, the content, the subject matter. Now, in the talk that we are bringing to you today, we deal with a slightly different aspect. We deal with the art of Charles Dickens. And to do this, we have with us today Professor Barbara Hardy, an eminent critic, Professor Emeritus, Birkbeck College, London, and author of several important critical books, among which is also The Moral Art of Charles Dickens. As she's going to take up passages from the text, it might be a good idea for you to keep the novel close at hand, to keep a notepad so that you can take notes as you go along. Now over to Professor Hardy.
My subject is the art of Dickens's great novel, A Tale of Two Cities, and in particular one aspect of that art, its patterning. The novel is a very conspicuously political one. It's one of his 2 historical novels, the other one being Barnaby Rudge, an earlier novel, in which he uses the past in order to bring out topics which are burning issues of the present. It's a very explicit, a very strong political novel. Central and sustained is the theme of revolution. It deals with the French Revolution. It also deals with perhaps seeds of revolution in the injustices of English society. And it does mention something that's very important, the American Revolution, the American War of Independence. So the theme, the political theme, is kept in the foreground. And perhaps for this reason, critics and scholars have rather tended to concentrate on subject matter, on theme, on content. And that is why I want to talk about the poetry of the novel, because Dickens is one of the great manipulators of the English language. And in his manipulation, one can see characteristics of poetry. I think one might suggest that in his very late period, and this is a novel of the late period, poetry becomes more dominant in Dickens's prose. You can see something of the same quality that I'm going to talk about in this novel in his last finished novel, Our Mutual Friend, which, like A Tale of Two Cities, has a very strongly marked rhythm, uses conspicuous repetition, underlines its forms of symbolism and construction. And you can also see it in what we have of his very last and unfinished novel, Edwin Drood. Dickens always used poetry, but in this last period he seems to be doing so in a much more conspicuous way. He seems also to be more confident. What he's doing in language is something that's come out of a long apprenticeship, a long developing mastery of narrative forms and also of images, of the rhythms and repetitions of language. But although I want to talk about art and about this quality of Dickens's poetic art, I must emphasize very strongly that I too am interested in subject matter, in theme, and in content. Dickens isn't simply writing playfully, though I think there are many moments in the novel where one realizes that he is delighting in the music and the ordering of his own language. But he's always using art, using these patterning devices I want to talk about for the purpose of moral argument, moral expression, and emotional appeal. In all Dickens's novels, he expresses social anger and compassion and fear. He writes very sensationally. He appeals to us through our nervous system. He appeals to our emotion. His novel is a political novel, it's a poetic novel, and the poetry is there in the interests of an affective, that is, an impassioned, an emotional appeal. So when talking about construction, I don't mean anything abstract, and I certainly don't mean anything purely aesthetic, that is coming from the pleasure in making shapes and forms. What I'm talking about is a moral art, an art of appeal and persuasion. I'd like to begin at the beginning to illustrate what I mean by poetry and patterning. The beginning of A Tale of Two Cities, well, the very beginning, of course, is actually the title, but the beginning of the narrative proper is one of the most famous beginnings in Dickens, who was very good at beginning powerfully. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair, and so on, through a long series of clauses linked rather loosely, from some points of view, by commas. Now, there are different ways of reading this beginning, and one critic mentioned in your unit, Martin Fido, sees it as a language which gives the impression of chaos and then reveals an underlying order. I read it rather differently. I don't think there's any suggestion of chaos whatsoever. Fido speaks of it as an unpunctuated beginning. It's a lightly punctuated beginning. You'd normally expect these clauses to be separated from each other by semicolons. And Dickens uses commas, but he does so, I suggest, because he wants to speed things up. But from the very beginning, there is the sense of order. There is a very emphatic repetition. It was the and of times is a common feature in those first two clauses. It's also held together very, very strongly by antithesis, best and worst, and age, epoch and epoch, season and season. There are two aspects of this splendid beginning I want to mention. One is that one of the ordering principles is that of repetition, and another, which I suppose is a subset or a subdivision of the figure of repetition, is twinning or doubling. Let me say a little bit about repetition first. Repetition is made very conspicuous, and what the novel does in this rhetorical emphasis, is this one figure of repetition at the beginning, is to establish one of its dominant modes. All the way through the novel, repetition is used. And there's a sense, of course, in which this is answering the promise in that title, which, as I've said, is our first encounter with Dickens's language, a tale of two cities. There is already the form of doubling, and the title promises that there will be a bringing together of objects and themes and institutions and cultures and countries, in some ways different, but in some ways the same. So this quality of repetition involves also variation. There are many, many moments in the novel where the language is repeated. In one very famous scene in the first book, it's called The Wine Shop, Dickens repeats the word hunger many times, and hunger is given a capital letter, so it becomes a kind of animation, a personification, obviously, a very important part of Dickens's political diagnosis, a very important part of his appeal to our anger and to our pity, and to our sense of social justice. So the repetition there is a poetic quality, but it's making a kind of emphasis, just as a politician will repeat a point many times. So Dickens, who is a kind of poetic politician or political poet, needs to drum home by repetition some of his thematic points. The word hunger is repeated until it becomes more than a word. In fact, Dickens calls it a sign. He says it's a sign that stares out everywhere, from the faces of the children, from the faces of the grown-ups, from the faces of the aged, and then gradually it becomes, through repetition, more animated. He says that it's pushed out of the tall houses in the wretched clothing that hung upon poles and lines. He says that it's patched into them, that's the houses, with straw and rag and wood and paper. He makes you feel the substances, the rotting objects. But hunger is repeated. And in fact, that phrase is actually used. Hunger was repeated in every fragment of the small modicum of firewood that the man sawed off. And then it becomes, as I said, a personification. It stares down. So it's a human, an animating language. It stared down from the smokeless chimneys, and it starts up from the filthy streets. Dickens is often thought of as a rather spontaneous, even naive writer. And one of the interesting things about this novel is the way in which the novel itself is aware of the devices it's using. This is something that modern criticism has become very interested in. But it's not simply a characteristic of modernist novels. It's a characteristic of earlier novels too, to draw attention to their own language, to their own constructions. And there's one episode I'd like to draw your attention to later on in the novel, where Dickens, through one of his characters, a minor character, one of the women characters, the English woman, Miss Pross, draws attention to his own rhetoric and also draws attention to what I've spoken of already as its emotional effect. Miss Pross is one of the many characters in the novel who's paired with another character in one of these acts of doubling and also divided in herself. She's paired with the heroine, Lucy Manette, who is characteristically young, beautiful, beloved, to become a wife and mother. Miss Pross is unattractive, severe, celibate, but a kind and loving companion to Lucy. And she's also one of the characters who represents something very English, but it's worth noticing, I think, because it's important, that she also, to some extent, makes herself French. She Gallicizes herself. She learns French cooking. But the way in which she's divided is interesting because it involves an exterior which seems to be very austere and restrained, reserved and unfeeling, and an interior which is full of vitality and emotion. And this comes out very clearly in the scene I want to remind you of. It comes from a chapter in the second book, a chapter called Hundreds of People, and in it, Miss Pross presents herself as someone unimaginative. Dickens rather likes teasing us and presenting characters who say they are unfeeling or they are unimaginative, and then showing us that there's more to them than they said or we thought. Miss Pross is also paired with another character, the banker, Mr. Lorry, and he also is one of these rather misleadingly unfeeling characters. Insofar as he works for the bank, he is, as he keeps saying, a machine, but all the time compassion and sensibility keep breaking through. Miss Pross, in the chapter called Hundreds of People, is asked by Mr. Lorry to imagine something. And she says, no, 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 don't ask me to imagine. I have no imagination. And then Dickens gives her a speech which immediately disproves this. In this speech, she's describing the compulsive behavior of one of the very important characters in the novel, Lucy's father, Dr. Manette. Dr. Manette has been in a tiny prison cell in the Paris prison, the Bastille, for 18 years. He's been shut up in a very small space, and although he has been writing, and although he has also been learning and plying a new trade, that of the shoemaker, part of his compulsive behavior involves walking up and down, as animals will walk up and down in the restricted space of their cage. When he comes back, when he is, to use Dickens's repeated phrase, recalled to life, every now and then some shock, some trauma makes him relapse, makes him revert to his compulsive behavior, and he goes back and makes shoes again. But he also can't stop pacing up and down. And Miss Pross tells Mr. Lorry that underneath the room where he and his daughter pace up and down, she listens. And she describes using repetition this compulsive activity. Manette is accompanied by his loving daughter, who again is a fixed type in Dickens, the young woman who, as it were, fulfills all the conventional female roles. She is the perfect beloved, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, and the perfect daughter. So what Miss Pross is talking about is Mr. Manette, Dr. Manette, getting up in the middle of the night, walking up and down, accompanied by Lucy, who in this passage is called by her nickname Ladybird. Sometimes, she says, he gets up in the dead of the night and will be heard by us overhead there, walking up and down in his room. Ladybird has learnt to know then that his mind is walking up and down in his old prison. She hurries to him and they go on together, walking up and down until he is composed. But he never says a word of the true reason of his restlessness to her, and she finds it best not to hint at it to him. In silence they go, walking up and down together, till her love and company have brought him to himself. Now, this is an example of what I mean by Dickens's prose poetry. there is the repetition which acts like a refrain in a lyric poem. There's repetition, but there's also variation. You've got these several sentences, including the repeated phrase, walking up and down, and then you have one sentence, the last but one, which doesn't contain the phrase. And you also have a variation, a new element in the very last sentence, where walking up and down is joined by the word together. You also have a slow start. Sometimes he gets up in the dead of night before you work into this very impassioned, patterned statement or narrative. It also has a very strong conclusion that together is the new element, the thing that isn't repeated, because in the prison he was alone, and now he has what the conclusion makes very emphatic. He has her love and company. You can see the way in which the whole passage grows, because earlier on the phrase is used until he is composed, but at the end the moral point, a very important one in Dickens, about love and company, is brought out, and it is the strong end of this speech, till her love and company have brought him to himself.
Can we pause here to think about some of the things that Barbara Hardy has said? She has been talking about one aspect of Dickens' art, his patterning. She has also talked about his use of repetition throughout the novel, his use of twinning or doubling, giving suitable examples from the text. Can you find other passages that illustrate these points? It might be worthwhile spending some time trying to do this. Also, you might like to go back to the beginning of the novel, to the famous opening lines, because now you have two readings of those, one Barbara Hardy's and one by critic Martin Fido that she refers to, and you'll find this in Unit 4 of Block 2, in which he says that the opening lines give the appearance of chaos. Now, Barbara Hardy doesn't agree with this. She thinks that there is a certain pattern in the opening lines. Now, which of these two critical opinions do you agree with? You can go back to the passage, look at it, and decide. And if you agree with neither of these opinions, well, you can formulate your own original response. And while you think about it, let me remind you to watch Part 2 of this program, in which Barbara Hardy continues her discussion of the art of Charles Dickens.